There are a lot of movies people constantly beg studios to make sequels to, and usually if a movie makes enough money, that's not a problem. Studios love sequels because they're easier to market, easier to sell, and usually safer financially. The real problem starts when a movie lands in that weird middle ground, where calling it a flop feels a little too harsh, but calling it a success also feels completely wrong. Movies like Warcraft, Alita: Battle Angel, Mad Max Fury Road, and Edge of Tomorrow all ended up in that exact category. And today we're talking about the last one on that list, because somehow, more than 10 years later, people still won't stop asking for an Edge of Tomorrow sequel. The story actually started back in 2009, when screenwriter Dante Harper wrote a script based on the Japanese light novel by Hiroshi Sakurazaka. The script quickly landed on the blacklist, which immediately made Hollywood pay attention. Warner Brothers picked it up in 2010 and reportedly paid around $3 million for it, which is usually a pretty good sign the studio thinks it found its next big franchise. The project moved forward fast, and Warner quickly brought Doug Liman on board to direct. And this is where the chaos began, because Doug Liman basically looked at the script and decided that outside of one really cool idea, the whole thing just wasn't working. Which, to be fair, became kind of a recurring theme throughout this entire production. Warner brought in Joby Harold, who had written Awake a few years earlier, to completely rework the screenplay and turn it into something bigger and more ambitious. Apparently, the rewrite worked well enough because by 2011, the studio was already offering the lead role to Brad Pitt. Why Pitt passed on the movie is still unclear. The usual explanation is that he had moved into his serious, dramatic actor phase and supposedly wasn't interested in giant sci-fi action movies anymore. Which sounds funny considering he later starred in World War Z, a movie where he spends 2 hours running away from CGI zombies. But maybe that somehow felt more artistic to him, who knows? After Pitt dropped out, Warner turned to Tom Cruise, who said yes. And honestly, at the time, it made perfect sense. Mission Impossible: Ghost Protocol had just been a huge success. Cruise's star power was rising again, and Warner probably thought they had found the perfect guy to launch a new sci-fi franchise. Ironically, years later, some people would actually blame Cruise himself for the movie underperforming at the box office. But bringing Cruise on board created another problem. The entire script now had to be rewritten again, because the main characters suddenly needed to be older, which changed a huge part of the story dynamic. And once the new version was finished, Doug Liman once again decided he hated most of it. According to Liman himself, he threw out nearly 2/3 of the screenplay, and even the parts he kept were heavily rewritten later anyway. At this point, Edge of Tomorrow basically became the Hollywood version of group project chaos. Warner kept bringing in more and more writers, hoping somebody would finally crack the code. Under Liman's supervision, the Butterworth brothers, who later worked on Spectre, rewrote the script again. Then Warner brought in Simon Kinberg. Yes, the same Simon Kinberg who would later direct Dark Phoenix. Exactly what Kinberg changed is honestly anybody's guess, because after that, Tom Cruise himself stepped in and decided the movie had become way too serious. Cruise thought the script needed more humor and more personality, so he brought in Christopher McQuarrie, who had already worked with him on Jack Reacher and would later become one of the main creative forces behind the modern Mission Impossible movies. McQuarrie kept rewriting scenes during production itself, which is usually not a sentence studios enjoy hearing when they're already spending hundreds of millions of dollars. And unsurprisingly, all of this eventually helped push the budget higher and higher. Filming officially began in the finest traditions of Gladiator, with an unfinished script and absolute chaos already happening behind the scenes. The production couldn't really afford to delay shooting because pushing the schedule back might have cost the movie both Tom Cruise and Emily Blunt, who actually joined the project at the very last minute. And somehow, the only person who didn't seem remotely stressed about any of this was Doug Liman. In fact, Liman seemed completely convinced everything was going perfectly. Just a few days into filming the massive beach landing sequence with Cruise, Liman suddenly decided that what they had shot was terrible. So naturally, he ordered parts of the footage scrapped and demanded the entire beach set be rebuilt from scratch. This is usually not the kind of sentence studio executives enjoy hearing after spending millions of dollars, and this became a pattern. Liman kept changing his mind constantly during production. The beach sequence alone was originally supposed to take 2 weeks to shoot. It ended up taking 2 months, which is slightly longer than planned. Then the production ran into another problem: the alien designs. Liman rejected what felt like hundreds of concepts because he was obsessed with making sure the creatures looked completely different from anything audiences had seen before. Whether all that effort was worth it is honestly up to each viewer to decide. But the real panic started after the first rough cut was shown to test audiences. Suddenly, it became obvious that parts of the movie simply weren't working. Entire sequences were removed, reshoots were scheduled, and new actors were brought in, including Jeremy Piven. Piven reportedly rushed to London to shoot scenes fighting aliens in the streets alongside everybody else. Which sounds impressive right up until you realize there's one small problem. You literally cannot find Jeremy Piven anywhere in the finished movie. And no, he wasn't hidden under alien makeup or buried somewhere in the background. Warner simply cut him out of the film entirely. Imagine flying across the world to battle aliens, only to lose the fight against the editing room. At this point, Warner Brothers was fully in panic mode. The studio suddenly decided the original title, All You Need Is Kill, had to go. According to Warner, using the word kill in the title of a PG-13 movie was apparently too risky. Somebody somewhere might get offended. Doug Liman completely disagreed with this decision. In fact, he hated the new title. According to Liman, Edge of Tomorrow sounded generic, outdated, and didn't tell audiences anything about the movie itself. He wanted the film to be called Live, Die, Repeat, which later became the movie's marketing slogan anyway. Ironically, years later, Warner would basically agree with him. When Edge of Tomorrow finally hit theaters in May 2014, the domestic box office numbers were rough. The movie opened with only $28 million and landed in third place behind The Fault in Our Stars and Maleficent. For a film carrying a $175 million budget, that was dangerously close to disaster territory. And to this day, a lot of people blame Warner's marketing campaign for the weak opening. The trailers heavily focused on non-stop war footage, explosions, and soldiers screaming at each other, which made the movie look suspiciously similar to Battle Los Angeles, a sci-fi invasion movie audiences and critics had already rejected a few years earlier. The problem is that Edge of Tomorrow is actually nothing like Battle Los Angeles. It's smarter, funnier, weirder, and way more self-aware. But Warner barely sold any of that in the trailers. A lot of viewers genuinely thought the movie was just going to be 2 hours of Tom Cruise running around a beach shooting aliens. Meanwhile, the marketing almost completely ignored one of the movie's biggest strengths, Emily Blunt. Which is kind of hilarious in retrospect, considering Rita Vertasky later became one of the most beloved sci-fi action characters of the entire decade. Cruise himself also got blamed for the movie's underperformance. Some people believed Oblivion, which had come out shortly before Edge of Tomorrow, hurt audience interest because both films featured Tom Cruise in futuristic sci-fi settings running around with assault rifles. And since neither movie became a massive box office hit, people started grouping them together. Eventually, Warner Brothers more or less admitted the marketing problems themselves. On later home releases, the studio started pushing the slogan Live, Die, Repeat much harder than the actual title Edge of Tomorrow, because many analysts and marketing experts thought it was simply a better and more memorable name. By the end of its theatrical run, Edge of Tomorrow made about $100 million domestically and another $270 million internationally, and honestly, if the movie had stayed within its earlier projected budget of around $145 million, it probably would have ended up profitable once all the extra revenue streams were counted. And with reviews this strong, Warner almost certainly would have greenlit a sequel immediately. But thanks to all the rewrites, reshoots, delays, and production chaos, the final budget climbed closer to $175 million, which completely changed the math. Ironically, reports later claimed Warner actually kept the marketing budget relatively low at around $100 million, which sounds financially responsible until you remember the weak marketing campaign is probably one of the main reasons the movie struggled in the first place. And then something interesting happened. Over time, Edge of Tomorrow slowly turned into a cult sci-fi favorite. Audiences kept discovering it on streaming and home video, and suddenly Warner Brothers started talking about a sequel almost immediately after release, despite the disappointing box office numbers. By 2015 and 2016, Christopher McQuarrie and Doug Liman were already saying they had a really interesting idea for a follow-up. Liman even described it as a sequel that would partially function like a prequel and supposedly change how audiences viewed the first movie. which honestly sounds either brilliant or completely insane, possibly both. The working title became Live, Die, Repeat, and both Tom Cruise and Emily Blunt were expected to come back. But the project quickly fell into the exact same loop as the original movie itself. Endless rewrites, scheduling problems, massive budget concerns, and later, the pandemic. Every couple of years, somebody involved would say the script was almost finished and production was finally close to happening. And then absolutely nothing would happen. In 2023 and 2024, after Cruise renewed his partnership with Warner Brothers, rumors about the sequel started showing up again. But even now, there's still no official green light. Technically, the sequel hasn't been canceled. But after spending more than a decade stuck in development hell, Edge of Tomorrow 2 honestly feels like it got trapped inside its own time loop. That was Frameback. Subscribe for more rewinds and see you on the next one.